Values: Building a Better World for All by Mark Carney. Mark Carney's Values: Building a Better World for All explores the profound and often detrimental disconnect between market value and human values that has shaped recent history, leading to significant crises. Drawing on his extensive experience as a G7 central bank governor and his time in the private sector, Carney argues that society has increasingly adopted a market fundamentalist approach, equating the monetary price of everything with its intrinsic value. This shift from a market economy to a market society, he contends, has corroded social capital, exacerbated inequalities, and contributed directly to the major crises of the 21st century. The global financial crisis, GFC, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the climate emergency. The book traces the evolution of value concepts, analyzes these three crises through the lens of values, and proposes concrete actions for leaders, companies, investors, and countries to reclaim fundamental human values and build a more resilient, sustainable, and equitable world. He frames this challenge with a parable shared by Pope Francis. The market distills humanity, like wine into grappa, down to self-interest, and our task is to turn the grappa back into wine, re-embedding the market within broader human values. The narrative begins by examining the historical perspectives on value. Carney contrasts objective theories of value, dominant from Aristotle through the classical economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx, with the subjective theories that emerged with the neoclassical revolution in the late 19th century. Objective theories root value in the production process, particularly the labor involved, and often distinguish between productive activities that create value and unproductive, rent-seeking activities that merely extract it. Early thinkers like Aristotle and the medieval canonists embedded economic value within broader ethical and moral frameworks, concerned with concepts like the just price and condemning usury. The mercantilists shifted focus to national wealth accumulated through trade surpluses and gold, while the physiocrats, reacting against them, identified land and agriculture as the sole source of true value, introducing systematic analysis with tools like François Quesnay's tableau économique. Adam Smith, often misrepresented as a champion of pure self-interest, placed markets within a rich social context in the wealth of nations and the theory of moral sentiments. He saw exchange as fundamental to human interaction, driven by self-interest, not from the benevolence of the butcher, but functioning effectively only when embedded in social norms like trust and fairness, mutual sympathy. Smith identified industry, not just agriculture, as productive, highlighting the power of the division of labor, but also warning against monopolies and the collusion of business interests. While pioneering in political economy, his labor theory of value remained incomplete. David Ricardo refined the labor theory and introduced the concept of comparative advantage, making a powerful case for free trade, but struggled to reconcile the differing time horizons of returns to labor and capital. Karl Marx built upon the classical labor theory, arguing that value derived from socially necessary labor time. He introduced the concept of surplus value, the difference between the value created by labor power and the subsistence wage paid to workers, which capitalists appropriate. Marx saw capitalism as inherently dynamic and unstable, prone to crises stemming from class struggle, mechanization displacing labor, the source of profit, and the parasitic nature of finance extracting value from the productive economy. This objective view of value, tied to production and social context, was overturned by the neoclassical subjective theory. Thinkers like William Jevons, Carl Menger, and later Alfred Marshall argued that value resides not in production, but in the utility or satisfaction a good provides to the consumer, determined on the margin. Value became subjective, residing in the eye of the beholder, and price in a competitive market became the measure of that value. This resolved paradoxes like why essential water is cheap and frivolous diamonds are expensive due to marginal utility and scarcity, but had profound consequences. Carney argues this subjective view, now dominant, leads society to equate market price with true worth. Activities or assets without a market price, like a stable climate, biodiversity, or community cohesion, are effectively assigned zero value in standard economic calculations like GDP. This narrow focus ignores market failures, externalities, monopolies, human cognitive biases like short-termism, leading to the tragedy of the horizon, distributional concerns, inequalities' impact on welfare, and the crucial role of non-market social capital, trust, fairness, in making markets function effectively. Critically, Carney posits this elevation of market value can corrode the very social and moral values it relies upon, turning moral sentiments into market sentiments. The narrative then explores the nature of money, the primary tool for measuring market value. Money functions as a store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. Modern money exists primarily as electronic deposits created by commercial banks through lending, fractional reserve banking, alongside central bank reserves and physical cash. Carney stresses that the value of this fiat money, no longer backed by gold, rests fundamentally on trust in the institutions that manage it, particularly central banks. He recounts historical episodes, like the debasement of Roman coins, the failure of the Bank of Amsterdam, and the chaos of the US wildcat banking era, to show that private monies and poorly governed systems inevitably fail. The gold standard provided a form of discipline, but ultimately proved too rigid, prioritizing external stability over domestic needs like employment and financial stability, and collapsing as political suffrage expanded and social priorities changed. Carney uses the UK's return to the gold standard in the 1920s, advocated by then-Governor Montague Norman against Keynes's advice, as a cautionary tale of clinging to past orthodoxies. Modern monetary stability, Carney argues, relies on independent central banks operating under constrained discretion, with clear mandates like inflation targets, operational independence, and strong accountability to the public. Embodying principles traceable back to Magna Carta's constraints on arbitrary power. He details his experience at the Bank of England, implementing reforms post-GFC to reunite monetary and financial stability mandates and enhance transparency and public engagement, including changing banknote characters to reflect diversity like Jane Austen and Alan Turing, to maintain legitimacy and public trust. The future of money is also examined. Evaluating cryptocurrencies, judged poor money substitutes but potentially digital gold stores of value, stablecoins, promising for payments but needing robust public oversight to avoid Bank of Amsterdam-like failures, and central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, the most likely future, potentially offering efficiency and safety if designed carefully to manage risks like bank runs and privacy concerns. China's social credit system represents a concerning alternative path where social capital itself is monetized and controlled by the state. Ultimately, Carney concludes, sound money requires strong public institutions grounded in values like trust, resilience, fairness, transparency, and accountability. Having established the dominance of market valuation and the institutional underpinnings of money, Part 2 delves into the three major crises of the 21st century: credit, COVID, and climate, arguing they are interconnected crises of values. The global financial crisis, GFC, of 2007 to 2009, is presented as a direct consequence of market fundamentalism. Carney uses his experience dealing with the Canadian asset-backed commercial paper, ABCP, crisis in August 2007 as a microcosm of the global meltdown. What began as sensible financial innovation, securitization, morphed into dangerous complexity driven by complacency and greed. Leverage soared. Risk was opaquely distributed through complex derivatives like CDOs and CDSs, and the originate-to-distribute model severed the link between lenders and borrowers, eroding underwriting standards. The shadow banking system mimicked traditional banking functions like maturity transformation, but without the necessary capital, oversight, or safety nets. Carney argues the crisis stemmed from belief in the three lies of finance: that this time is different, ignoring historical cycles, that markets always clear, ignoring liquidity risk and uncertainty, and that markets are moral, ignoring the erosion of trust and responsibility when finance becomes detached from the real economy and social values. The crisis revealed the fragility of this system and the injustice of too-big-to-fail institutions being bailed out by taxpayers. Carney details the frantic crisis management efforts, learning lessons about the need for overwhelming force, contra moral hazard fundamentalists, clear communication, and international cooperation in a world shifting from US hegemony, G1, towards multipolarity, G0. He describes the G20's mandate to the Financial Stability Board, FSB, which he chaired after Mario Draghi, to build a safer, simpler, fairer financial system. Key reforms included drastically increasing bank capital and liquidity requirements, creating resolution regimes to end too big to fail, making derivative markets more transparent and robust, example, central clearing, regulating shadow banking, and establishing macroprudential policies to manage systemic risks and financial cycles. Crucially, he argues, rebuilding trust requires embedding ethical values, aligning compensation with long-term risk and conduct, example, bonus deferral, clawback, establishing senior manager accountability, like the UK's SMR, and fostering a sense of vocation and responsibility for the system among financial professionals. The improved resilience of the reformed system, he notes, proved vital during the subsequent COVID crisis. The COVID-19 crisis is presented as a stark failure of valuing resilience. Despite ample warnings from experts about pandemic risks, governments globally failed to adequately prepare, lacking sufficient stockpiles like PPE, testing capacity, and robust health system surge capabilities. Carney attributes this to cognitive biases, present bias, disaster myopia, and political systems that undervalue long-term preparedness. When the crisis hit, the immediate response in most countries prioritized health over the economy, with widespread lockdowns supported by public solidarity. This revealed societal values leaning towards Rawlsian protection of the vulnerable and communitarianism, rather than pure utilitarian calculation or libertarian individualism. However, the crisis also brutally exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities, impacting low-wage workers, minorities, women, and the young disproportionately, particularly through job losses and educational disruption. Carney argues against framing policy purely as a trade-off between lives and livelihoods, using metrics like the value of a statistical life, VSL, which attempts to monetize mortality risk reduction. He traces the history of VSL, noting its methodological flaws, reliance on flawed assumptions about rationality and information, and ethical problems, potential to devalue certain lives, neglect of non-monetary aspects of well-being like dignity. Instead, he advocates a cost-effectiveness approach, setting clear societal goals based on values, like controlling the virus spread, R0 less than 1, while ensuring fairness and preserving economic dynamism, and then finding the most efficient policies to achieve them. This requires acknowledging uncertainty, communicating transparently, fostering trust and legitimacy, and targeting support to address the asymmetric impacts of the crisis. He sees the pandemic as forcing a potential reset, accelerating digital transformation and supply chain shifts, but also creating an opportunity to rebuild better by embedding values like resilience, solidarity, and fairness more deeply into economic and social structures. the climate crisis is framed as the ultimate tragedy of the horizon. Carney outlines the stark scientific reality: human activity driving unprecedented warming, carbon budgets rapidly depleting, especially for the 1.5 degrees target, and devastating impacts on ecosystems, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, extreme weather, and human societies, dislocation, conflict, health impacts. Already occurring and set to worsen dramatically. The economic costs, while hard to estimate precisely, are potentially catastrophic, far exceeding standard GDP-based calculations by ignoring non-market values and systemic feedback loops. Current policies and market valuations are dangerously inconsistent with the agreed Paris Agreement goals, implying warming of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius rather than below 2 degrees. The crisis stems from market failures, unpriced externalities of pollution, the tragedy of the commons, and governmental failures, short-termism, lack of policy credibility. Carney argues that solving it requires harnessing engineering technology, renewables, efficiency, hydrogen, CCUS, political technology, setting clear, credible net zero goals backed by policies like carbon pricing and regulation, and financial technology. Finance must be rewired so that climate considerations become central to every investment decision. He details the framework being built around the 3 R's: reporting, making TCFD-aligned climate disclosure mandatory and comprehensive; risk management, transforming how financial institutions assess physical and transition risks using scenario analysis and climate stress tests; and returns, mainstreaming sustainable investing, developing metrics like portfolio warming potential to align investments with net zero pathways, and recognizing the transition as a major investment opportunity. International cooperation is vital, including fulfilling climate finance commitments to developing countries and potentially creating global carbon offset markets. Success requires building a broad social consensus, ensuring policy credibility to pull forward private investment, and recognizing the urgency dictated by climate physics. Building on the analyses of the crises, Part 3 outlines how to reclaim values and build a better future. Carney identifies 7 core values essential for a successful and just market economy: dynamism, resilience, sustainability, fairness, responsibility, solidarity, and humility. These values need to be actively nurtured. He emphasizes the importance of values-based leadership. Effective leaders, he argues, are made, not born, and focus on catalyzing action towards a clear purpose by developing people and setting priorities. Key leadership attributes include purpose, understanding the organization's why, acting as a steward; perspective, seeing from the periphery, engaging with diverse views; clarity, simplifying complexity, communicating honestly and with empathy; competence, execution matters, learning from mistakes; and humility, recognizing limits, admitting uncertainty, acknowledging luck. Leaders must rebuild trust through transparency, accountability, and competence, moving beyond expertise to embody the values they espouse. Purposeful companies are central to creating shared value. Carney rejects shareholder primacy, a la Friedman, as legally and economically flawed, advocating instead for stakeholder capitalism, where companies balance the interests of employees, customers, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. True corporate purpose goes beyond profit. It involves solving societal problems. This requires embedding purpose in governance, strategy, and compensation, linking pay to long-term value creation and non-financial ESG metrics. He cites evidence that purposeful, high ESG companies often outperform financially. Divine coincidence, by attracting talent, fostering innovation, building trust, enhancing resilience, and maintaining social license. He points to structures like B Corps and entreprises à mission that legally embed broader purpose. Investing for value requires aligning capital allocation with societal goals. Carney details the spectrum of ESG investing, from risk mitigation to impact investing, focused on measurable social, environmental outcomes alongside financial returns. While acknowledging challenges in ESG measurement, data gaps, rating divergences, monetization difficulties, he sees enormous potential, particularly in impact investing and financing the climate transition. He argues fiduciary duty must evolve to encompass beneficiary values and long-term welfare, not just short-term financial gain. Key is developing robust reporting, integrated financial and sustainability impact accounts, and metrics, like portfolio warming potential, to allow investors to assess alignment with goals like the SDGs and net zero. Finally, Carney outlines how countries, using Canada as an example, can build value for all. National strategies must foster dynamism, competition policy, innovation support, SME finance, build resilience, strong institutions, social safety nets, preparedness, ensure fairness, progressive policies, regional support, inclusive growth, drive sustainability, credible net zero plans, green investment, valuing natural capital, indigenous partnerships, and promote solidarity, lifelong learning, skills development for 4IR, support for displaced workers. He advocates for a values-based, cooperative internationalism, focusing on outcomes and shared standards, like the FSB model, to manage globalization and tackle shared challenges like climate change, moving beyond rigid rules-based systems and narrow nationalism towards a patriotism grounded in shared values and common purpose. The book concludes with a reflection on humility, recognizing uncertainty, acknowledging limitations, admitting the role of chance, and understanding our responsibility as custodians are essential for navigating the complex challenges ahead. Carney calls for a conscious effort to rebalance market value with human values, moving from a market society back towards a market economy embedded within a framework of shared purpose and ethical considerations. By doing so, he argues, we can channel the dynamism of markets to build a more resilient, sustainable, fair, and ultimately more prosperous world for all. The task is to turn the distilled grappa of pure market logic back into the rich, complex wine of human flourishing. If you enjoyed this book breakdown, please consider liking this video and subscribing to get notified when we post our next book.